Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much to Kristoffer Ahlstrom-Vij for giving us the first seminar in this generation of fellows of Center for Advanced Studies, Southeast Europe. Kristoffer is a reader and chair in philosophy at Birkbeck College, research fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and research associate at LSE's Center for Philosophy and Natural and Social Sciences. We're very happy to have him here with us. He has already once participated in at the beginning of this year, I think, at the conference that was also co-organized by Center for Advanced Studies, so we're very happy to have him again. And he will be giving us a talk today on the subject of post-truth. So, Kristoffer, I would like to give you the floor. Thanks.
Right, thanks so much, and thanks for having me, and thanks for showing up. So remind me of the format. So this is not a very long talk. So do we have an hour or?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
I mean,
great.
as much as you need, basically. It's not strict in any sense.
Perfect. No, that should be plenty of time. So let me just start by sharing my screen. Let's see. There we go. So take it people are able to see that. Let me see, just one. I want to do this. Do this as well. Okay, good. So just a little bit of background to this talk, to the project that this talk is part of. I've been interested for a while now in the relationship between information, political attitudes, and true belief, and so forth. So naturally, I've become interested in this idea that has become very popular in recent years, this suggestion that we somehow now live in some form of post-truth era, whatever that's supposed to mean. And I started digging into this literature, partly kind of popular literature, partly academic, partly popular, a little while back, because I was interested in evaluating this suggestion. And to be honest, I started out being quite skeptical. I started out expecting to find or discovering that maybe there wasn't really a lot of empirical substance to the suggestion. That's not quite where I ended up, as we're going to see, but that's where I started out, at least. And specifically, what I started out doing was, of course, again, it's a fairly widespread, some of it not particularly academic literature. So I started with what we might think of as an explication of what the relevant authors have in mind. So they formulate this idea in slightly different ways. I settled on what I thought was the most charitable and interesting formulation of the relevant claim, which is what I put here as the claim. So that's the idea that sometime in the period of 2008 to 2016, so I think the period leading up to the Brexit referendum here in the UK and to Donald Trump becoming president in the US. So sometime in that period, the empirical substance of politics became significantly less relevant to what political preferences we form. So what do I mean by the substance of politics? Well, I think there are a couple of things that can be true of political policies. So one is there might be certain truths relating to what is its nature, what are the implications of the relevant policies, and so forth. And these are the things that I have in mind when I talk about the empirical substance of politics. Another thing that might be true for certain policies is that certain people tend to endorse the relevant policies. So I call these identity cues, right? So for certain policies, people like me will be supporting that type of policy. For other policies, people like me will tend not to support relevant policies. And we tend to have a good sense often of kind of what policies are part of the package that comes with our team and what policies comes with a package of other teams. So So one idea behind this is something that political scientists have been studying and concluding for a while now, which is that what is driving the acceptance of political options are often identity cues rather than the empirical substance. So it's not so much that we look at some menu of policies and then we evaluate the empirical substance of it, and then we decide that, okay, that seems to be the best one, so that's the one I'm going to go for, and I'm going to vote accordingly. Rather, what we tend to do is we tend to start with our identity cues. What type of person am I? Okay, what type of policies do people like me endorse? And then the empirical substance would follow. So that's the idea that I think here is encapsulated in the relevant type of claim. Now, a note on the timing here. So this timing, 2008 to 2016, that's drawn from the literature. This is a period that often comes up in the literature. So that's the period that we'll be focusing on as well. And I should note here that the claim as formulated here is neutral on the mechanism. So why is it the case that what's driving acceptance of political options are identity cues as opposed to empirical substance? Well, the claim doesn't take a stand on that. It might be any number of different things. There are lots of proposals out in the literature relating to motivated reasoning and certain biases and so forth, right? But as such, the claim is neutral on that. And I think that's a virtue of it. Most importantly, it's a testable claim, right? We can empirically test whether this is borne out by the evidence. And how can we do that? Well, we can do that by looking at what's known in the political science literature as information effects. So information effects is something that you get by looking at survey data that contains a number of things, including established measures of people's degree of political knowledge, as well as, of course, their demographical features, their socioeconomic features, and so forth. And you then use that to evaluate or estimate a counterfactual, namely, not how people actually responded in the relevant survey data, but how they would have responded had they been fully informed, as measured by the relevant political knowledge scales. And this is a fairly established methodology in political science, and one of the most important pieces of work here is the one I put on the right here, which is Althaus's collective preferences in democratic politics. And then the information effects that I mentioned, they simply measure the distance between people's reported preference or attitude and the preference or attitude they likely would have had under full information. So the easiest way to think about this is, so imagine some binary preference, right? So you might either be for or against a relevant policy. We might code that as 1 or 0, for example. And then what we might do is we might statistically model the probability that you would endorse the relevant policy under the relevant counterfactual circumstances. So of course, the probability would fall in the interval of 0 to 1. And then we would simply look at the distance between that probability and 0 for actually do not endorse, or 1 for actually do endorse. So that's the relevant distance that you would designate the information effect for each individual person. Now, a word is in order on these knowledge scales, since obviously they're important to this type of modeling. And it builds on work by Michael Delacapini and Scott Keeter from the 90s. So what Delacapini and Keeter found that provided that the items that go into the relevant knowledge scales concern the broad categories of what government is and does, and the political leaders and parties and so forth, kind of who's who, the relevant scales don't need to be particularly long to be diagnostic. Specifically, they find that it doesn't seem to matter that much if, say, you have a scale with 5 items as opposed to 25. And moreover, the relevant scales tend to correlate with independent interviewer ratings. So imagine you have people who in person deliver the relevant type of surveys, and they will give their own judgment on how politically informed the person they've just been interviewing is. Those type of ratings tend to correlate well with the relevant knowledge scales as well. And also it tends to correlate well with political behaviors that we have independent reason to believe will be related to political knowledge, such as political participation. The more you know, the more politically active you tend to be. Finally, since, according to Delacapini and Keeter, people tend to be generalists when it comes to political knowledge. So if you know a lot in one political domain, you tend to know a lot in other political domains as well. Then, as they write, researchers developing national or general political knowledge scales need not be overly concerned with a mix of specific topics covered by individual items. So, coming back to this claim, and specifically the suggestion that I made that it's a testable claim. So the idea is then that if it's the case that sometime in the period of 2008 to 2016, the empirical substance of politics became significantly less relevant to what political preferences you form, then it should be the case that these type of information effects, so again, the differences between actual preferences and estimated fully informed ones, they should have diminished over time. And why is that? Well, because if the empirical substance doesn't matter for what political preferences you form, then knowing more about that substance should, of course, not make a difference. That's why we should expect the relevant information effects to diminish over time if the claim is true. So, a couple of things about how I then went about testing this claim. So the data that I used was cross-sectional data for the election years of 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016 from the American National Election Studies time series study. So this is in many ways the kind of gold standard for political opinion data in the US. And this is also conveniently exactly the type of data set used by Dell'Ecopini and Keeter in developing and validating their knowledge items. So as a result, in this data set, you also have 4 established knowledge items, and I'll put them here. So it's what party held the majority in the House of Representatives before the election, who is the House Speaker, who is the Vice President, and who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so this 4-item battery I then used to build a knowledge scale using something that's known as item response theory. And the benefit of using item response theory as opposed to, which is sometimes done, you simply sum up the correct answers. In this case, you would then get a score from 0 to 4, is that, of course, there are different ways you can get, say, 1, 2, and 3 correct answers, right? You might imagine that, for example, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that's possibly a more difficult question than who is the Vice President. So in other words, someone who gets that one right should maybe be differentiated from someone who gets another one right, even if maybe they have the same number of correct responses. And that's something you can differentiate if you use item response theory. And moreover, you get a continuous value assigned to the relevant knowledge scale if you use IRT. So that's another nice feature. Of course, this data set also includes standard demographics and socioeconomics, such as gender, income, education, and age, and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about which ones I have been controlling for here and why. Now, in terms of the dependent variables, the variables on which I wanted to look for an information effect, identified 6 suitable such variables. Now, the idea here was that to find a sufficiently large set and sufficiently varied set in order to get some form of generalizability on any potential results, but not have such a large set that it would become unwieldy in terms of modeling, since it would require many statistical models to model all of them. So I settled for the 6 that I put here. One is support for a Republican as opposed to a Democrat for president. So this gets to, of course, directly to voting preference. Whether the respondent thinks same-sex couples should be able to adopt. This gets to social ideology. Whether the respondent thinks less government is better than more government, which gets to economic ideology. Whether the respondent wants to see immigration levels increased. This gets to a question about race and diversity. Whether the respondent thinks government should make it more difficult to buy a gun, which gets to questions about authoritarianism. And finally, whether the respondent favors the death penalty for murderers, again, gets to questions about authoritarianism. Now, then when you're engaged in this type of counterfactual modeling, what you're trying to do, of course, is you're trying to tap into a causal relationship specifically between someone's level of knowledge and someone's attitude on particular questions. Now, of course, it is not a trivial matter to take observational as opposed to experimental data and infer causal relationships. And one reason, of course, that this is not trivial is that, so imagine that you have your observational data set. It is going to be the case, for example, that people that are highly educated or perhaps have larger incomes will be also correlated with knowing more. Right? Now, these type of correlations, of course, present a problem for you when you try to make an inference simply from someone's level of knowledge and the effect of that on people's political attitudes. So what you try to do there is you try to use what's called propensity scores. And propensity scores are simply a way to try to break the correlation between variables that are not of interest. Right? So specifically, what I did here was that I took the knowledge variable and then I recoded it as a binary variable with all observations in the 75th percentile on that variable coded as 1. So these are my fully informed respondents, and everyone else at 0. So I use 75th percentile here as opposed to perhaps everyone with the maximum score. Well, one worry that is sometimes raised by this type of information effect modeling is that you are modeling an unrealistic level of knowledge. So the idea here was that by being somewhat generous in who gets to qualify as fully informed, you will avoid that particular objection. So then, having recoded the relevant variable as a binary one, in this case, you calculate the relevant propensity scores, which in effect measure the probability, so the propensity of someone being fully informed as a function of demographic covariates. So again, so you would expect, for example, that whether or not you're highly educated or high income, that would predict it of whether or not you are in the category of fully informed. So that is the predictive quality that propensity scores will measure for you. And then what you do is when you fit your model, you weight the relevant estimates with the inverse of the propensity scores. So this will, again, serve to break, hopefully, the relevant correlation between the variables that you are not interested in measuring the causal effect of, and mitigate any problems that you might otherwise have about making causal inference on observational data. So just to illustrate here, so this is the case of the income variable in the 2016 data set. Now on the x-axis here, you have the percentiles from 1 to 5. And you have in these bars, you have where it says treatment 0, these are the group of uninformed. And where you have 1, this is the group of the informed. And as you see here, the unadjusted sample in the left panel, this is where we have not factored in the propensity scores. Then we find exactly what we would expect, that in lower income percentiles, people who are uninformed are overrepresented. And in higher income brackets, people who are informed are overrepresented. Again, this is exactly the type of correlation that will be problematic insofar as we are trying to estimate a causal effect. What you see here on the right is once we have factored in the relevant propensity scores. And what you see here is what you'll want to see, which is that the relevant bars within each bracket are roughly identical, right? So this will tell you that income is no longer predicted of whether or not you fall in the informed or the uninformed category, exactly the way we want. So this is what propensity scores will do for you. One more note about causal modeling. Of course, it's crucial in causal modeling. We talk about doubly robust estimation. There are two things to that. The first one is propensity scores. The other one is that you also use careful assumptions about what to control for. Now, of course, we don't have anything like a complete causal model of how our political preferences come about. what we can do when we try to do causal modeling is we draw up a causal graph like this, sometimes referred to as a directed acyclic graph or a DAG. And we simply are explicit about the causal assumptions that we're making. So this is essentially the assumptions I'm making about, we have Y here on the right. So that's essentially your political preferences. And you have no on the left. So that's your level of knowledge. And the assumption here is, like we said, that knowledge will have an effect on your political preference, but lots of other stuff will do as well. Your age, your income, your marriage status, whether or not you're part of a union, your level of education, and so forth. So this is simply to encode the assumptions that we're making for purposes of modeling, and specifically the things that we're looking to control for. Now, I just want to highlight one thing here, and that's the variable that's in the middle of this graph, which is party. So that's partisanship, right? So partisanship, of course, is highly predictive of the political preferences that you take. That goes without saying. And as a result, is a very common variable to use in modeling political attitudes. Now, I actually think there's a case for not controlling for partisanship in the context. And the reason for that is obvious from the relevant graph here, which is that partisanship is on a causal path from knowledge to political preferences. So this is, in the causal literature, it's known as a mediator, right? And essentially what happens if you control for a mediator is that you're blocking the relevant causal path and you're thereby potentially misestimating the effect that you're looking for. So you do not want to control for mediators. Now, at the same time, because it is controversial, particularly the extent to which there is a causal edge from knowledge to partisanship in the way that I put in this graph, it is controversial whether or not you should be controlling for partisanship. So as you're going to see later on when I show you the results, I show you the results both with controlling for partisanship and without controlling for partisanship. We're going to see that it doesn't make a huge difference. So that's good. So that serves as a kind of a robustness check. Anyway, this is just to make clear the causal assumptions that I make in modeling. So finally, before we get to the results, in terms of then estimating the information effect, which is of course the thing that we want to do here. First of all, what we want to do is we want to aggregate the actual proportion of support. So this is how people in fact responded in the data set. And this was estimated by simply determining the proportion of support in the data set for each of the dependent variables and year, after having weighted each observation using the survey weights to approximate representativeness. Then to aggregate the informed support, which is what we want to compare with the actual proportion of support. Then what I did was that I set the knowledge variable as 1 for each observation. So think about what this means. You can think about it on the model of, imagine that we could somehow administer a knowledge pill to all respondents, such that they immediately became fully informed, as I've understood it, but remained identical in all other respects. Right? That's what we're modeling here when we take each observation and we set the knowledge variable as 1 for them. And then what we do is we ask the models to, once we've done that, estimate the probability of support, of informed support for each observation. And then, of course, just as we did with the actual portion of support, we aggregate these probabilities and factor in the survey weights as well to approximate representativeness. And then, of course, we have everything we need for information effect, because now we just need to look at the difference between the actual proportion of support and the informed support. That is our information effect. So these are the results that we get. So these are 6 dependent variables that I mentioned earlier. So let's go through them one by one. So if we start at the top left here, so this is the supporting a Republican as opposed to Democrat for president. So what you see here on the x-axis, of course, is just the year, the election year. Remember, we have 4 election years, 2004, 8, 12, and 16. And on the y-axis, you have the size of the information effect in percentage points. Right? And specifically, the hollow points are the cases where the relevant knowledge effect was not significant, and the filled points are the ones where it was a significant estimate. So what we see here specifically, you see from 2008 to 2012, the 2 points where we have a significant knowledge coefficient, there was a drop from about 2.5 down to about 0.5 in the information effect that we see. Now, I think we should take this at the same time with a grain of salt, given that you see the dotted line here. Those are the estimates that we get if we also control for partisanship. So arguably, on these particular models, you have a failure of the relevant robustness test. So I don't think we should make too much of that particular panel. Now, moving to the right here, wanting more immigrants and also wanting stricter gun laws. Here we see the type of pattern that we should expect if the post-truth narrative is correct. You see over time, from 2004 to 2016, there's a trend of the relevant effect to become smaller. And similarly, if we go to the bottom left panel about wanting same-sex couples to be able to adopt, here arguably have an even clearer instance of a drop in an information effect. In this case, a fairly substantial one. You see here, this is in the neighborhood of, this would be close to 20 percentage points down to about 0. So a fairly substantial drop in the relevant information effects. Now, turning to supporting death penalty and wanting less government, less of a clear picture here. Arguably, in the case of supporting death penalty, so here notice you have the 0 effect at the top here. So you would expect the relevant graph to tend upwards, and to some extent it does that, but in a less clear-cut fashion, perhaps, than some of the other variables. Similarly, for wanting less government, potentially if we focus on the 3 estimates where we have a significant knowledge variable, you see a drop from 2008 to 2016. But again, slightly less clear-cut than the other 3 cases that I mentioned. So to sum up, so for the period that we set ourselves to investigate, from 2004 to 2016, we do see some evidence of a decrease in information effect over time. Specifically, we see this on party preference, but more decisively, I think, on 3 political topics that typically garner a lot of attention in political discourse, at least in an American context, namely immigration, same-sex adoption, and gun laws. And this, of course, is in line with what I suggested we should expect to see if the type of post-truth claim that I identify is correct, at least on these issues, and for the time period covered by these models, what you know about the substance of politics does seem to be decreasingly relevant to your political preferences. Thanks so much. I'm going to come out of this so I can see you all. There we go. Happy to put the slides up again if there's anything you want to ask about.
Thank you very much, Kristoffer. I would now open the floor for questions or comments from the audience. Okay, maybe I can start. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I would like to first sort of just, if maybe it's not a question, it's more of a clarification and maybe a bit of a so to just maybe a bit more comprehensive account of the idea of this of epistemic substance of politics. I mean, what do we? I mean, if I understood you correctly, in the case of your models, the questions were mostly related to the sort of positions and people who fill certain positions of relevant political positions, so to speak. I mean, but there are obvious, but you also mentioned the sort of implications of policies and things like that, and these seem to be like different kinds of knowledge and with different relevance, perhaps to actually make a just sort of justification and other epistemic considerations in the political context?
That's right. Yeah, thanks. Good question. So this gets to the knowledge scales, and it gets to this question specifically of people being generalists in the domain of political knowledge. So, I mean, what people have found is that answering these types of questions, the kind of who's who questions correctly, tend to correlate very well with being politically informed in a much broader sense, right? So there, in other words, it's not the case that answering these particular questions is constitutive of being fully informed, but is diagnostic of being fully informed. Just like in a medical context, you might administer some particular diagnostic tests, not because you're thereby measuring necessarily the thing that constitutes being sick, but rather measuring something that is reliably correlated with having a relevant disease, such as, for example, measuring antibodies or something like that. So that's exactly what's going on in this type of case as well. Does that help?
Sure. I mean, and also what is the relevant knowledge? If this is just diagnostic, is the relevant knowledge then related primarily to sort of like the purely sort of empirical aspects of, I don't know, if you have some purely technical, very sort of straightforward, already tested aspects of policy decisions, or are we talking about more of, like, I don't know, more controversial set of knowledge claims about politics? And also the implications of policies are more often than not basically just, I mean, guesses. I mean, there are probabilities. It's not completely clear what will be the sort of consequences of politics, obviously. Policies. What is the core sort of political knowledge?
So the way I think about the type of political knowledge that's being measured here is the type of political knowledge that would make you an effective political operative, right? So you understand how the system works. You understand who the people involved are. You understand their roles. You understand what it would take for certain things to happen, and so forth. So you have a set of factual knowledge about the political world that will arguably help you no matter your particular political preferences, right? Because you have some particular political preference and you want to bring about some political outcome. Well, then you better understand who does what and how the relevant political machinery works. And that's what I imagine that the relevant political knowledge does for you. Now, of course, there are other types of political knowledge that are not measured by that are not identical to that type of knowledge. You might imagine, for example, that there are certain forms of situated political knowledge that will be beneficial for political action. For example, it might be that it will be either beneficial for you or maybe for the polity if you might know what it's like to go without food for days on end. You might know what it's like to be on the receiving end of racism, right? These are things that you might know that will be beneficial for political action. It will, if nothing else, color, maybe inform your political priorities in a way that might be beneficial for society. Now, that's not measured by these type of knowledge scales, of course, but the idea is that, so say you have such situated knowledge, right? If you don't also have the type of knowledge had by an effective political operator, then it will be very difficult for you to realize the ends that you are going for, to connect your ends with reliable means and so forth for achieving the relevant political goals. So that's why I think the relevant political knowledge is important. It's not the entirety of political knowledge. It's not the only thing that's important, but I think it's a crucial component of effective political action.
Thank you. Do we maybe have some questions?
think Gabriel had his hand up.
Yeah, I think you need to open your mic, Gabriele.
Okay, yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Kristoffer, for your beautiful speech. My idea, my feeling is that politics has never been driven by empirical substance. Already Lazarsfeld, Campbell, Converse explain that that the citizens' vote is driven by the identification. Yeah. You are very good. Your research is very interesting because you explain the possible dynamics of identification now, also in relation to knowledge. Yeah. By the way, my question is, what is your opinion of the knowledge of citizens about the coronavirus pandemic? Right. And what is the role of politicians and experts? What should politicians and experts do about this problem?
Wow, it's a big question. I'll do my best. I've done some relevant work that I could talk a bit about. But on your first point, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I kind of hinted at this with reference to this. I mean, as you point out, this idea that what's driving political choice is identity cues as opposed to what I call the empirical substance of politics. That's something that political scientists have been saying for about 100 years at this point. So there's nothing new about that. And now what I think maybe I'm doing in this paper and in this talk is that it's quite possible that there is an even greater disconnect at the moment, right? So it might have been that, you know, as Hannah Arendt talked about, that politics and truth have never been friends, right? Maybe they're even less friendly at the moment. That's possible. But at the end of the day, to really kind of evaluate that claim, I would need to probably engage in a type of historical investigation that I'm not necessarily the person to do. But point taken, absolutely. Now on the coronavirus, it's a big question, and I don't think I can really answer it. Now we did together with a collaborator, we fairly recently ran a study here in the UK where we were looking at a couple of things. One thing we were looking at was the relationship between knowing things about the coronavirus and the attitudes that you take to, for example, certain types of restrictions and so forth. So for example, what is the relationship between being highly informed about coronavirus and you know, supporting mask mandates, travel bans, and so forth, right? That's one variable that we looked at, or rather two variables, how they played with one another. And interestingly, at least at the period of time that we were looking at, and in the country that we were looking at, we didn't necessarily see an interesting effect there. It wasn't necessarily the case that how much you knew made a big difference to what attitude you would take in that particular context. Now, there were other interesting kind of relationships that we looked at in relation to trust in government and so forth that are not directly relevant to what you know, but yeah, we didn't find any kind of interesting headline findings about the relationship between knowledge and attitudes in relation to coronavirus. Unfortunately, would have been interesting to see that.
Grazie, thank you, Kristoffer.
No problem.
I also think it's very interesting that there is like not really a connection between, I mean, this also seems quite headline worthy in some sense.
You mean on the coronavirus question in particular?
Yeah, it also seems quite interesting. I mean, there is a sort of there tends to be some kind of intuitive consensus in sort of commentary world that, and even among scholars, I mean, purely on this sort of sense when you make some kind of it tends to be an epistemic judgment, like these are people who are not knowledgeable enough. If only they had more knowledge, they would have made different choices and have different preferences.
Yeah,
and that's kind of, this is lacking.
That's kind of what we were expecting, that roughly people who know more will be more supportive of restrictive measures. Now, I think, I mean, it is possible that the particular time period that we ran this study was in a summer period where I think in retrospect, a lot of people felt that this was essentially last summer. And people essentially would have felt that, you know, it's kind of over, right? You know, sun is shining, we're out again, you know, no more lockdown. And it's quite possible that that was really kind of dampening any effect that you might see between other variables, because the kind of overall level of concern and so forth were simply low in general. But yeah, we're still working on analyzing the data, so let's see what we find.
Maybe I could just, well, sort of, I colonized the whole talk, but just on a more sort of speculative side question, do you find that this, I mean, 2008 appears to be quite, could it be, I mean, do you find this to be some kind of symptomatic moment at which you see this even further, you know, even stronger drop in relevance of knowledge on politics? I mean, it just seems so specific this year that you have the sort of breakdown of I mean, financial crisis and sort of rise in distrust in I mean, presumably a strong rise in distrust in institutions. I mean, and even sort of, and in their sort of global aspects, and also in a sort of I know, impotence of national institutions to you know to fight the global aspects of institutions and stuff like that. And then at this point, I mean, it is imaginable to see some, you know, something that at this point people just say we don't care about our political system. It feels like it feels impotent to do anything of value for us. I mean, as I said, it's very sort of speculative, but I would like if you maybe have some thoughts on this.
No, it's quite possible. Yes, I didn't mention the financial crisis, but of course that's relevant as well. That's another relevant event in the time period that I'm looking at, and it's quite possible that that would have a similar kind of effect of people turning away from, you know, traditional political vehicles. People being generally becoming more cynical about politics, maybe giving up on the relevant form of traditional politics, and maybe that, you know, simply culminating in the kind of stuff that we see in 2016. That's quite possible. I mean, I think to really answer that question properly, we would need someone who is kind of more skilled in that type of kind of granular historical, even of contemporary historical work than I am, right? But I think it's certainly a plausible narrative on the face of it, at least, that kind of stuff would play a role.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you very much, Kristoffer, for this talk, and I hope we'll have a chance to host you again at CAS and at the University of Rijeka, and have a lovely day to all of you and to Kristoffer.
Right. Yeah, thanks to you for hosting this, and hope to meet you all in person at some point as well. So thanks.
Yes, that would be great to see each other live.
That's right. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Likewise. Ciao.